So the people who teach in higher education make a lot of money. Now, most of us think that teachers are underpaid and everybody thinks they deserve more money than they actually make, but let's look at the numbers, the reality.
I want to have my performance reviewed. I've had quite a year.
Let's start with the story. There's a doctor of Greek history and literature at UC Davis, University of California, Davis, who was assigned 2 classes, a lecturer for a few years at UC Davis, and recommended, because they were large classes with 120 students, recommended a former undergrad student of hers to be the research assistant, the teaching assistant for these 2 sections. So she recommended, and the dean's reply came back saying that they had hired this undergrad, not yet pursuing a master's degree, to be a TA for a Ph.D. teaching these 2 large sections at UC Davis, only to discover that the teaching assistant was going to make $300 a month more than the Ph.D. teaching the course. Her name is Amanda Reiterman. So what do you think Dr. Reiterman did? She quit, everybody says. Actually, she didn't quit. She said, I'm not going to do that. I'll teach different classes. And she was reassigned smaller classes without a TA making more than her. The TA was still going to make more. And that's what happens to adjunct professors. But everybody was screaming, oh, way to go, Dr. Reiterman. You quit. You showed them.
I wish I knew how to quit you.
She didn't quit. She just taught different classes. Adjuncts don't quit. Adjuncts, we take what we can get. Tap the like button, and I'll tell you more. Hi, I'm James Callahan, and this is the Do-Over Show, and one of the things I've done for more than 20 years is teach at 8 or 9 colleges and universities, public, private, undergrad, grad, as an adjunct professor. History, religious studies, nonprofit work. Yeah, I've done a lot of those things, but the interesting thing in those 20 years has been that adjuncts people like me, tend to be underpaid. And everybody is willing to admit, yeah, maybe they are underpaid. But does that mean other people are making a fair wage? So let's go back to the story. Dr. Amanda Reiterman, who realized that her teaching and research assistant was going to make more. It's because of a UC-wide system strike that took place, collective bargaining, earned all TAs and RAs a bump in salary, but didn't impact the adjuncts, people who were just held as lecturers, teaching part-time, less than full-time, less than tenure track. Adjuncts, temporary employees, seasonal workers, like the people who mow your lawns or move your snow in the winter if you live in places like that. They come and go without any permanent relationship with the college or university. So she moved to another class rather than suffer under the ignominy of teaching a class in which a bachelor degree holding person in the class, helping her administer the class, was going to make $300 more a month. But she still taught other classes. So that brings up the question, not of adjuncts being underpaid. Everybody knows that. I've done videos on that. You can check out those videos here. But let's look at everybody else. People who teach in higher education. How much do they make? Are they paid well? Are they paid appropriately? Does it reflect their years of experience and education, their PhDs, their masters? Does it show that they actually have distinguished themselves? So let's look at the data. The first piece I want to look at is from the American Association of University Professors. It's an update from earlier this year, and it says the title is Real Wages for Faculty Are Far Below Pandemic Level. The AAUP released preliminary data of their faculty compensation survey. Here are the details. Average salaries for full-time faculty members, all ranks, increased 3.8%, following a 4.1% increase the prior year. They're up. So what's the problem? Average salaries for full-time members increased 3.4% among public institutions, 4.3% among private independent institutions, 4.9% among religiously affiliated institutions. They got a bigger increase at religiously affiliated institutions. What's the problem? Real average salaries for full-time faculty members increased 0.4%, the first time in 4 years that wage growth has exceeded inflation. But we are nowhere close to the levels before the COVID pandemic. Consumer Price Index for all urban consumers, or CPIU, increased 3.4%. in 2023, 6.5% in 2022, 7% in 2021, and 1.4% in 2020. Average salaries for continuing full-time faculty members, those employed in the fall of 2022 and remaining employed in the fall of 2023, increased 4% in nominal terms and increased 0.6% in real terms after adjusting for inflation. That means that the amount of increases that took place actually increased at a slower rate than prior to the pandemic. Okay, so that means that in the slowing economy during the COVID era, higher education has suffered while other industries continue to expand, so that they are actually, if you work in higher education, full-time, part-time, administrators even, your rate of increase has suffered from two things. One, a slowing of that increase, and two, the impact of inflation. Okay, so you're making less comparatively to other people in other professions, as well as to the way you were making money up to 2019. There's the first detail. But those aren't real numbers. You're like, I want numbers. Come on, Callahan, give me numbers. How much? So let's look at them by title. So all institutions, the average for a professor is 155. At a public university, it's 145. At a private or independent, it's 196. Religious affiliated, 136. So even though there was an increase over the last 4 or 5 years in the percentage of increase in religiously affiliated institutions, they still make considerably less than the average. Okay, associate professor, 106, 104 public, 120 in private, 97 at religiously affiliated. Great. Assistant professor, that's where you start out as a tenure track. You're hired usually early in your career as an assistant professor. On average, 92,000, public 90,000, private 105, religiously affiliated 83. Okay, instructor. Now here's where it breaks down, and this is where it gets confusing because not everybody means the same thing when they use words like instructor or part-time or full-time or adjunct. So instructor generally means people that don't have tenure track but are teaching full-time. Now this means if they're in a larger urban area, they're in a union, so they have a 1 or 2 or 3 year contract as an instructor, but they're not guaranteed anything beyond that. Or if they're in a smaller institution, they're hired from a year-to-year basis. That is, they get an annual contract. So there's the instructor. Generally, it's about 69,000, 65 at public institutions, 79 at private, and religiously affiliated, 73. Why is it higher? Because at religiously affiliated institutions, they don't have tenure. Because being able to sign a statement or a declaration of faith is usually, and being monitored by the academic dean, who is sort of like overseeing whether or not you're teaching in a way which accords to the religious affiliation, background, statement of faith of the organization, the creed, the institution, or the donors that are giving, and if they like or don't like you. But you're not guaranteed. There's no tenure at many of those schools, the smaller ones in particular. And so that's why the number is a little bit higher than at public institutions for the same kind of role. Lecturer, these are people who are brought on. Now, this includes the category of people who are celebrity adjuncts, former mayors, presidents, influencers, bigwigs, Wall Street. They come in and they teach, and they might be lecturers. They may teach 1 or 2 courses, a seminar, grad school, very popular. They're a name attraction, but it also means people who are kept on an unofficial sort of pool of qualified professionals who are going to teach. And that would be like the doctor at UC Davis, who is regarded as a lecturer. So on average, they make 75, 70 at public, 95 at private, and 66 at religiously affiliated. Those without rank. Now, those would be people who teach full-time or have enough part-time that associated with it, they work multiple part-time jobs. There are 2 different criteria that the AAUP uses to crunch these numbers, so I'll leave it at that. The average is 76 at public, 74 at private, 74 at religiously affiliated. That's how much actual different ranks in higher education make. That is, 112 is the average for all institutions, 106 for public, 137, almost 138 for private or independent, and just over 102 for religiously affiliated institutions. But we're still missing something, and that is the lowly adjunct, the people who make on average $2,700 a semester per course to teach as an adjunct. If they teach 3 courses, that's 3 times that number, whatever the institution is paying. Larger institutions in metropolitan areas will pay more because they have to be more competitive, not because they have more money. If they could get away with paying you less, in fact, some do, some who have attractive schools where it's more prestigious to be part of the school, that you would teach there, it would be a bonus to you, would benefit you having it on your CV. I remember having a conversation with a board member at a private religiously affiliated institution that said that every time they advertised an open position, no matter what field, even though there was a high standard of qualification, only a certain niche of people qualified would be able to sign the statement of faith, they said that they don't have to pay more. In fact, they're able to pay less for open positions and even for tenure track early positions because they get hundreds of applications for each and every single opening that's advertised. And they said they intentionally pay less because they know that they're going to have hundreds of applicants because it was prestigious to have that institution's name that you taught, even as an adjunct at that school, that you taught at that school on your CV. That is, this was also the board member that said that their goal was to eliminate tenure and move to a post-tenure review to get out all the dead wood. Dead wood was the phrase the trustee used to get the dead wood out. He was a president of a major American corporation, publicly traded, who was chairman of the board for several years and made it his sole purpose to eliminate tenure and to move out all of the older profs who he said were making way too much money. A report from the American Federation of Teachers in 2023, it found that a quarter of adjuncts earn less than $26,500 annually. That is self-reported. That's everything they make from teaching what they're able to teach. Now, it doesn't mean that they all teach full-time. It may mean that they teach part-time. It may mean that they supplement their income elsewhere. But people who are primarily dedicated to teaching in higher education but have an adjunct status, that is no permanent promise of any continuing, any future, averaged about $26,500 from the 1,000 plus respondents to a recent survey. That means that that gap between people who are full-time and people who are adjuncts is growing wider and wider every year. But as that gap grows wider, the number of adjuncts employed at institutions, 2- and 4-year colleges and universities, public and private, the number of adjuncts employed continues to rise. And when professors retire, if they ever retire, most of them just die, but when they go away, those positions are not filled. The financial incentives for trustees to pay, and by the way, trustees are the reason why things are the way they are. Trustees set this number. Trustees managing the market, managing the finances, working with the business model of the institution where 95% of today's colleges and universities are run out of tuition-based programs. That is the tuition that's paid by the students, and as the cost goes up, but it has not increased for adjuncts. In fact, that's been a money saver for trustees as they've cut back on filling full-time positions and use part-timers to pay them same class loads, to pay them half of what a full-time professor would be making at that institution. Okay, one last drill down on the numbers about adjuncts. Self-serving, I realize, but a lot of you are wondering because this is not widely known, and I'm doing my best to get the word out about what adjuncts earn because this is the first step in figuring out whether or not you're getting paid well, you're not, or whether there's a future in it for you. Probably not the way things are going economically, not just with the country, with the global economy, but with the economic model of higher education. That is, it's not sustainable if they decide all of a sudden to be overly generous with adjuncts, because we have been the reason why they've been able to cut costs of faculty and yet maintain their status as something more than an Airbnb. So the numbers themselves, the average rate of someone who works at a undergrad institution is $2,263 they're taught per class, they receive per class. At a degree granting institution, it becomes $4,620 if they have a grad program, for example. At my school, where I teach in the suburbs of Chicago, you get $50 more per class if it's graduate rather than undergraduate. I once taught a class that was both had grads and undergrads in it. It was for upper class members, and it had some grad students in it. And so I asked, do I get $50 more? And they said, no, most of the students are undergrads, so you're still going to get the undergrad pay. That's the reality that we have to live with. So within that, not only do adjuncts make appallingly less than the average full-time, whether associate to full professor, makes at a college or university. They receive no benefits, no job security, no promise of anything, and you barely get an office. Usually you work out of your trunk or out of your car and you grade papers at stoplights or at Starbucks, if you can afford Starbucks. You know who you are. So let's take that final look now at the question. Do people who teach in higher education make enough? Okay, let's start with the reality. No one thinks they make enough money. We all think we deserve more money doing what we do. But the other person, they're overpaid. They shouldn't make money for doing that. So we all skew that. So that one, we're not going to be able to figure that one out. But when we look at the numbers, that is compared to people who hold that degree, bachelor's degree, people who teach in higher education and hold a bachelor's degree are actually above the national average when it comes to income for bachelor's degree holders. Okay, there's the reality. PhDs, master's degrees, there's not much difference unless it's a terminal degree in your field. There's still a few places that you can only get a master's degree and then you have to go to a parallel field to get a PhD. But for PhDs, it's a very small percentage of the population. There are a lot of them, and there are a lot of them looking for work as teachers. The report is that 10 are graduated annually for every one full-time position that's advertised. Okay, that means that we have an overabundance of PhDs for the number of job openings. That may suppress wages. Remember the trustee I talked to you about. But that might also mean that we shouldn't look to higher education to sustain for a sustainable living if you have a PhD. And more people are finding their way using their PhDs to leverage that in the private sector. Not just doing research in STEM fields, but I have a PhD and yet I work in marketing and communications and advocacy in the public sector, and I use my degree on a daily basis. And one of the reasons why I left full-time higher education was because I wanted to make more money and I wanted to turn my degree into something that worked for me rather than just fit into a very small niche. So if that's you, if you're in that setting, I encourage you, look to the right and to the left and find parallel tracks where you can, if you cannot survive or can't get into higher education, that you can use your degree to your benefit. It used to be that people with a PhD were overqualified. Not anymore. Now the standard is, that's unique. How can you use that? What transferable skills do you have? Figure that out and you can turn your advanced degree into an advanced lifestyle advantage. And thanks for being part of the Do-Over Show. Please tap the like button because it really helps. And while you're down there, how about you subscribe and ring the notification bell so you don't miss the next episode. I'm so glad you found me and I found you. Thanks.